Late 4th century Alexandria sat on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, serving as the critical juncture between European, African, and Middle Eastern trade routes. It was the second largest city in the Roman Empire, housing roughly 500,000 people, and it operated as the undisputed intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. Operating within this environment was Hypatia, the last major public philosopher of the ancient world. By the year 400 CE, she was the head of the Platonist school of Alexandria, teaching mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy to elite audiences. Here at Originex, we rely entirely on primary surviving texts and archaeological evidence to strip away modern assumptions and reconstruct erased historical events. Subscribe to the channel to support our work in documenting the actual human archive. Alexandria at the turn of the 5th century was a volatile, densely packed, multi-religious African capital. Recognizing the specific political pressures of this city is the only way to understand how the classical world finally collapsed. The modern public memory of Hypatia has almost nothing to do with her actual life. It is a retroactive, ideologically driven fabrication. In his 1980 television series Cosmos, Carl Sagan presented her as a secular proto-scientist murdered by religious zealots solely for her astronomical discoveries. The 2009 Alejandro Amenabar film Agora pushed this narrative further, casting her as an atheist, proto-feminist icon battling religious fundamentalism. These 20th and 21st century portrayals directly contradict the surviving early 5th century primary sources. By discarding the film scripts and returning to the contemporary ancient texts, the historical record reveals a highly calculated political assassination. The authentic circumstances of her life and her death are far more rigorous, complex, and disturbing than the comforting myths projected onto her by modern Hollywood. The first major historical misconception is that Hypatia was the first woman mathematician. She was not. The ancient Greek historical record documents several female mathematicians who preceded her by centuries, including Pythagoras' wife Theano, Hypatia of Alexandria, and her own contemporary Pandrosion. Hypatia is simply the most prominent and best documented female mathematician of antiquity, rather than the first. Modern scholarly analysis of the surviving mathematics demonstrates that she was a preserver and compiler of existing knowledge. She did not discover new theorems. Her primary output was in the late antique tradition of hyponemata, the creation of detailed commentaries designed to clarify, structure, and edit older, highly complex texts for a new generation of students. This Greek manuscript illustrates the kind of dense editorial work she performed. The Byzantine encyclopedia known as the Suda credits her with definitive editions of the Arithmetica of Diophantus and Ptolemy's Almagest. This is a brass astrolabe. Surviving letters from her most famous student, Synesius of Cyrene, show him writing to Hypatia for practical, hands-on advice regarding the physical construction of astronomical and hydrometric instruments like this one. Producing commentaries was not a secondary task. Her editorial work under the hypomnemata tradition was the specific mechanical process that preserved Greek mathematical knowledge through the collapse of the Roman Empire. A second pervasive myth dictates that her murder occurred simultaneously with the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. This specific falsehood originates entirely from Charles Kingsley's 1853 Victorian novel, Hypatia. Kingsley deliberately compressed the historical timeline to create a more dramatic climax, forcing the death of his protagonist to align with the fall of the city's intellectual institutions. Looking at the actual timeline, the Serapeum Library was destroyed by a mob in 391 CE. Hypatia was murdered in 415 CE. A rigid 24-year gap separates the burning and her assassination. These are two distinct events. One did not cause the other. Collapsing these decades into a single apocalyptic afternoon obscures the slow, highly factionalized political decay that actually consumed the city. The final myth positions Hypatia as a secular atheist or a Christian heretic who was targeted specifically to suppress her scientific beliefs. She was neither. The contemporary sources explicitly identify her as a pagan Neoplatonist who openly taught mixed audiences of both high-ranking Christians and pagans without facing religious persecution for her curriculum. The primary texts reveal that the motive for her assassination was a bitter secular political turf war over who held ultimate legal jurisdiction in Alexandria. The city was locked in a power struggle between Orestes, the Roman civil prefect appointed by the emperor, and Cyril, the newly elevated and highly aggressive patriarch of the church. Hypatia acted as the chief political and philosophical advisor to the Roman prefect, Orestes. This document outlines the conflict over who ordered the assassination. The ancient accounts fracture along lines of bias. Socrates Scholasticus implies the mob acted to remove a political rival. Damascius explicitly accuses Patriarch Cyril of ordering the hit. The assassination was a calculated, targeted strike designed to sever the civil prefect's advisory network. It was a brutal consolidation of civic power, not a war on science. In March 415 CE, a Christian mob led by Peter the Reader ambushed Hypatia's chariot in the streets of Alexandria. They dragged her from the street and forced her inside the Caesareum, a former pagan temple converted into a Christian church. Inside the church, the mob stripped her naked and killed her using ostraca, sharp, broken pieces of roofing tiles and pottery. Following the murder, they dismembered her body, transported the remains to a location called Canaran, and burned them. The sheer, calculated savagery of the attack was the physical manifestation of Alexandria's civil authority failing, replaced entirely by medieval religious violence. Hypatia did not die while discovering new mathematical theorems, and she was not burned alive alongside the scrolls of the Great Library. She was a brilliant compiler and preserver of ancient mathematics, who was torn apart because she occupied the geographic center of a jurisdictional power struggle between the Roman state and the emerging church. Her actual historical reality, a political operative eliminated to consolidate administrative control, is far more intellectually disturbing than the sanitized martyrdom narratives constructed centuries later. The murder in the Caesareum brought a 700-year tradition of Mediterranean philosophical pluralism to a definitive end. Truth, time, humanity.